Most people watching the skies over Jamaica today see one thing: U.S. military helicopters slicing through the air, carrying food, water, and medical supplies after a devastating hurricane. To the untrained eye, it looks like a straightforward humanitarian mission. But if you zoom out, if you pay attention to the timing, the scale, and the silence surrounding this operation, a different picture starts to emerge. A picture where Jamaica may have stepped into the center of a geopolitical shift without a single press release, public debate, or national consultation. And as small as the island may seem on the world map, what is happening now could shape the entire Caribbean's future for decades. Before we get into the deeper layers of this story, make sure you subscribe, because conversations like these rarely get discussed openly, especially when the truth is complicated, sensitive, and tied to global power. To understand the weight of this moment, we need to go back to the beginning. Hurricane Melissa wasn't a storm that Jamaicans shrugged off. It wasn't the kind you ride out with candles and laughter. Melissa arrived like a freight train, a Category 5 monster that tore through communities without mercy. Homes shattered, roads collapsed, rivers overflowed. Entire sections of the island went dark for days. Jamaica has faced hurricanes before, but every island has that one storm that becomes part of its national memory. Melissa is that storm. It exposed how vulnerable an island can be when nature decides to reclaim the land and rewrite the landscape. And then, within hours, the United States military appeared. Not trickling in, not sending a few personnel, but arriving with force. Jamaica became the landing ground for an impressive lineup of aerial machinery. 3 CH, 47 Chinooks, 3 UH, 60 Blackhawks, multiple SICH, 53 E-Super Stallions, logistics teams, tactical crews, and nearly a dozen military aircraft. For the ordinary Jamaican watching from the ground, the rumble of those engines felt like hope. It felt like help. It felt like the storm was finally over. But behind the relief, behind the gratitude, a quiet question hung in the background. Why did Washington move this fast, and why with this level of strength? To answer that, you cannot focus on Jamaica alone. You have to widen the view and observe the Caribbean as a whole. Because while Jamaicans were sweeping debris from their yards and checking up on neighbors, something unusual was unfolding across the region. In Trinidad and Tobago, U.S. warships appeared at the docks with little warning. Advanced stealth aircraft were being positioned in strategic pockets of the southern Caribbean. Venezuela began issuing loud warnings, accusing Washington of preparing for military confrontation. Suddenly, the Caribbean didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a chessboard, and that makes the timing of the U.S. deployment in Jamaica uncomfortable to ignore. Throughout modern history, powerful nations have used moments of chaos to reposition themselves. Natural disasters create opportunities that would otherwise be politically explosive. When a country is desperate, overwhelmed, and struggling to recover, saying no to help becomes impossible. Moving assets becomes easier. Establishing a presence becomes more acceptable. Surveying terrain looks innocent. A military helicopter landing to deliver water is one thing. A military helicopter landing to test the response time of local infrastructure is another. But both actions look identical from the outside. This is the quiet skill of global powers. They know how to move without looking like they're moving. And so, while Jamaica was receiving aid, the U.S. military was also doing something else. They were assessing. They were mapping. They were calculating. They were determining which landing zones could support heavy aircraft, which ports could handle rapid deliveries, which roads could handle military-grade equipment, and which areas could serve as future staging points. To the average citizen, these looked like standard relief operations. But to analysts, they were measurements. Let's bring Trinidad and Tobago back into the discussion. Trinidad did something that shocked regional observers. It openly welcomed a U.S. military presence through exercises that happened at the same time Venezuela was accusing Washington of preparing for military action. That wasn't a small decision. It was a major signal. Once Trinidad took that position, the geopolitical balance tilted. It created pressure. It created expectations. And it pushed neighboring islands into quieter roles they may not have been ready for. which is where Jamaica steps into the frame. Jamaica isn't just another Caribbean nation. Its geography is important. Its position near vital sea lanes matters. Its political relationships matter even more. In a potential confrontation between the U.S. and Venezuela, Jamaica represents valuable real estate without needing to build anything permanent. Washington doesn't need a base with barbed wire and gates. They need access. They need flexibility. They need the option to move quickly when the situation shifts. Hurricane Melissa gave them that access on a silver platter. Under the humanitarian banner, the U.S. military didn't just drop off food and leave. They learned the land. They tested routes. They observed how fast they could mobilize into and out of Jamaican territory. They looked at how easily they could redirect aircraft from Jamaica to other nearby regions. They evaluated which parts of Jamaica's infrastructure could support rapid military logistics if a crisis unfolded. And here's the part most people overlook. Even if the troops leave, even if the mission ends, the information stays. The strategic advantage stays. Once a military power understands your terrain, your ports, your airfields, your vulnerabilities, and your strengths, they never forget it. That knowledge becomes part of their planning, their simulations, and their future operations. Now imagine a scenario where tensions with Venezuela escalate. Will Washington rely entirely on Trinidad? Probably not. It would be reckless for a military strategist to have only one staging point in a region as unpredictable as the Caribbean. Secondary locations are always part of the plan. Spots where aircraft can refuel, where supplies can shift, where personnel can regroup, where operations can adapt. Jamaica checks every box. But here is where things get even more delicate. While all of this was happening, Jamaican officials maintained an unusual silence. No bold statements, no clarifications, no extended press briefings. Silence in politics is rarely accidental. It often signals that leaders understand the gravity of the situation but don't want to stir panic, debate, or backlash. From a Jamaican government's point of view, why start a fire you are not prepared to put out? The country needed assistance. Declining help from the United States during a Category 5 disaster would have been unthinkable. But acknowledging what the mission might evolve into, that would raise uncomfortable conversations. How long will these troops remain available? What agreements were made? What promises or concessions follow this visit? And what does all of this mean for Jamaica's relationship with Venezuela? These questions sit beneath the surface, unspoken but unavoidable. And as the region slowly divides into strategic lanes, Jamaica finds itself occupying a space it did not choose. Trinidad has already picked a side. Venezuela is preparing defensively. The Dominican Republic has strengthened ties with Washington. Cuba remains aligned with Caracas. And Jamaica, by virtue of a hurricane, has suddenly become a potential piece in a much larger geopolitical puzzle. The truth is, U.S. humanitarian missions rarely stay purely humanitarian. History shows a predictable pattern. They arrive to help, then return for training, then return for joint drills, then expand those drills, then establish recurring operations. Over time, the present stops feeling foreign and starts feeling normal. And once it becomes normal, it becomes permanent without ever being declared permanent. This is the modern version of influence. Not bases, not flags, not uniforms marching through streets. Just access. And Jamaica, whether intentionally or accidentally, may now be part of that access network. This carries us deeper into the implications, the silence, and the long-term consequences that often hide behind moments of crisis. Because to understand why the United States may not truly leave Jamaica, you have to understand how modern military strategy works. It is no longer about planting flags or building permanent bases. It is about building networks of access, influence, and readiness. And Hurricane Melissa opened a door that may remain open long after the winds died down. Let's dive where we left off, the normalization of presence. Throughout the 20th century, military power meant bases, barbed wire fences, large compounds, and soldiers marching on foreign soil. But today, the model has shifted. The U.S. understands that building a base is politically sensitive. Governments fear public backlash. Citizens question sovereignty. Neighbors interpret it as aggression. So instead of building, the strategy is to borrow. If a country allows temporary access during a crisis, that access becomes a template. It becomes a pattern. It evolves into a habit. By the time the public realizes what has happened, the arrangement feels familiar, even routine. And that is where Jamaica stands today. Melissa gave Washington a chance, not only to help, but to observe. They learned the island's air capacity. They tested how the Jamaican defense forced coordinates under stress. They took note of which airports can handle heavy aircraft under short notice. They looked at which parishes have strong communication lines and which ones collapse quickly. They quietly studied the island's vulnerabilities, strengths, and logistical potential. For the Jamaicans receiving aid, these were acts of kindness. For strategists, they were data points. Now, look at the bigger picture. The United States is currently reconfiguring its footprint across the Western Hemisphere. For the past 2 decades, much of Washington's attention was consumed by the Middle East. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. Those regions pulled resources, focus, and long-term planning. But with those conflicts winding down, the U.S. is pivoting back to its own hemisphere. And that pivot has 2 major priorities: stabilizing the Caribbean and containing Venezuela. Venezuela is not just another South American country. It holds some of the world's largest oil reserves. It has long-standing alliances with Russia, China, and Iran. And Maduro's government sees U.S. military movements in the Caribbean as threats to its sovereignty. In the last year alone, Venezuela has mobilized troops, conducted large-scale military drills, and accused Washington of preparing for intervention. That means the Caribbean is no longer just a region of tropical islands. It is slowly becoming a buffer zone, a tension belt, a place where signals are sent through presence rather than bullets. And within this shifting landscape, every island matters. Trinidad made its decision openly. Barbados strengthened its relationship through diplomatic channels. Suriname and Guyana are becoming more important because of their new oil fields. Cuba, as always, sits outside the U.S. sphere. But Jamaica has always been different. Not hostile, not blindly aligned. A careful middle player, which is exactly why the United States needs it. Jamaica sits in a strategic location between routes used for trade, energy movement, and military logistics. If the U.S. wants rapid access to the southern Caribbean without relying entirely on Trinidad, Jamaica becomes the obvious alternative. And an alternative doesn't need a base. It just needs cooperation. It needs open runways. It needs ports that can receive supplies. It needs a government that won't resist if aircraft land suddenly. And after Melissa, Jamaica meets all of those conditions. Now let's address something that might seem uncomfortable but must be said. Jamaican officials stayed quiet for a reason. When a country is struck by disaster, any help is welcome. But if a government stands in front of cameras and announces deeper military involvement, the public reacts. Some fear loss of sovereignty. Some worry about foreign influence. Some question whether alliances are balanced. Silence avoids all of that. Silence buys time. Silence gives leaders space to manage the crisis without being forced into political defenses. And that silence, during the relief mission, told analysts far more than words could. Because silence is a strategy too. While Jamaica recovered, Washington gathered more than just data. They evaluated the reaction of the Jamaican public. They watched the tone of local media. They observed whether any Jamaican politician would protest or raise objections. None did. And for military planners, that is a green light. A quiet public is easier to work with than a divided one. A quiet government is easier to negotiate with than a defensive one. And once trust is established during a crisis, expanding that trust later becomes simpler. Now imagine the next steps. Relief missions often evolve into joint training exercises. These exercises are framed as beneficial because they strengthen disaster readiness. Then come cooperative operations, which are framed as opportunities for skill sharing. Then come recurring visits linked to security collaboration. Over time, these visits become expected rather than surprising. They blend into the background of regional partnership. And eventually, military access becomes part of the normal relationship between two states, even if no official base exists. The United States has used this model in Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Temporary missions turn into long-term access. Access becomes influence. Influence becomes leverage. And leverage determines how the region responds during crises. Jamaica may now be entering that phase without ever declaring it. But beyond geopolitics, let's talk about the Caribbean as a whole. The region is entering a period of uncertainty. Oil discoveries in Guyana and Suriname have drawn global attention. Shipping routes near Cuba and Puerto Rico remain critical for global trade. Chinese investment is growing in ports, telecom networks, and infrastructure across the region. And Russia's influence through Venezuela remains a factor. In other words, the Caribbean is becoming a quiet playground for global powers, each pulling for influence. Jamaica's role in this new era will not be determined by speeches or interviews. It will be determined by events like Melissa. Disasters shift alliances. They accelerate decisions. They open doors. And when a superpower steps in at the right moment, the relationship often deepens in ways the public doesn't fully see until years later. And that brings us to the central question. Will the U.S. actually leave Jamaica? Physically, yes. The aircraft will fly home. The Marines will return to their bases. The mission will be declared complete. But strategically? No, not in the way the word leave is traditionally understood. The United States now knows the terrain. It knows the air routes. It knows how quickly it can deploy. It knows which parts of the island can serve as operational points. That knowledge stays. The cooperation established during Melissa will form the basis of future engagements. In geopolitical terms, once a country becomes part of a strategic plan, it rarely exits. Presence no longer requires permanence. Influence no longer requires construction. Modern geopolitics is subtle, patient, and adaptable. And Jamaica, because of a hurricane, now sits inside that framework. The final message of this expanded script is simple. Melissa may be remembered not only for its destruction, but for the doors it opened. A moment of desperation may become, in hindsight, the moment Jamaica was quietly pulled into the center of a regional security map. A map shaped by superpowers, shifting alliances, and rising tensions. Jamaicans will rebuild. Life will return to normal. But the decisions made quietly during this period, the partnerships formed under pressure, and the presence that felt temporary may shape Jamaica's future far more than anyone realizes today. If you found this deep dive useful, like, share, and subscribe. More investigations into Caribbean politics, global strategy, and hidden regional shifts are coming soon.